a trip to the infinite inning can determine the outcome of a pennant race as much as the talent on the team, vagaries of the schedule, or lucky bounces of the ball. The player-manager of the 1911 St. Louis Cardinals was Roger Bresnahan, 32 years old, and a tough guy. He's in the Hall of Fame as a catcher, and perhaps simply because, as a catcher, he popularized the wearing of shin guards and a face mask rather than just standing a ways back behind the bat and hoping that every bone in your face didn't get broken. But he was also a tremendous player, a leadoff man with a career on-base percentage of nearly .400, and a star on John McGraw's early Giants teams. He was not a soft guy. During his career, people thought of him as having an Irish temper because he was born over there. But in fact, he was from Toledo. The Irish temper, though, was real. Bill James said of him, almost every paragraph written about him seemed to include the adjective fiery. He was one of those guys that if you were on his team and played hard, he was as nice to you as could be. But if you got on his bad side, you'd think he was the breath of hell. Retrosheet lists 30 ejections for Bresnahan as a player and another 26 as a manager. He only managed 5 years. My favorite story about him, about his intensity, was the one about how he got to be catcher in the first place. See, Bresnahan played a bit of everywhere, came up as a pitcher, moved to the outfield, spotted at third base, but one day he was talking to McGraw, and he said, "Our catcher sucks. Why don't you get a real catcher on this team?" And McGraw, probably just being sarcastic or drunk or hostile or both, he was usually one of those three, if not all of them, said, "You think it's so easy? You do it." And so, from then on, Bresnahan was a catcher and was awesome at it. This was not a guy who got pushed around easily. And yet, everyone has their breaking point. On the night of July 11th of that year, the Cardinals were changing series. They had just finished a 4-game set with the Phillies in Philadelphia and had dropped the last game. They won 3 of 4, but the last game they had the misfortune to run into a rookie named Grover Cleveland Alexander. The Phillies were a pretty good team that year, and as the Cardinals taking 3 of 4 from them suggests, so were they. At the conclusion of that game, they were 10 games over 500 and on a pace for 87 wins, a little uptick, and you could imagine a pennant being in the offing. They were in 5th place, but it was a tightly packed league, and they were only 3 games back. So running into Pete Alexander aside, things were looking up. That night, they got on the Federal Express, a train that ran from Washington to Boston to go play the Braves. It was a big train, an important train, on the New York, New Haven, and Hartford Railroad. It was the same train that William Howard Taft, who was president at that moment, liked to take when he went out of town. The Cardinals occupied 2 sleeper cars out of 6 in total. There was also a day coach full of convention goers returning from Atlantic City where they'd attended the annual meeting of the Northern Christian Endeavorers. In addition, there was a car full of fish. It sounds a bit surreal, but the government was bringing a load of fish to be seeded into lakes. I'm not really sure. The train's consist had the Cardinals coaches up towards the front, not too far behind the engine and the tender. Bresnahan complained his players couldn't sleep from all the noise. When the train crossed into Manhattan, they actually listened to him. It was broken up and reordered. This added an hour-and-a-half delay, and the 2 Cardinals cars were moved way to the back of the train. At that moment, a relief engineer was also called in, presumably a more rested driver to finish the trip up to Boston. Thing was that he didn't know the route as well as the guy he had replaced. They took off again. A mile and a half out of Bridgeport, Connecticut, the train hit an embankment, going 60 miles an hour where the speed limit was only 15. It jumped the track, plunged, depending on what you read, 15 to 30 feet. The day coach, the car that replaced the Cardinals car in the lineup, suffered the most damage of any car in the train. It was just destroyed utterly. The engine, the tender, and 7 other cars were completely wrecked. The engineer and the fireman were hurled 60 feet from the wreck and crushed beneath the tender. Most of the injured were pinned by wreckage, and the responding firemen carefully had to chop them free with axes. The living were intertwined with the dead, sometimes their family members. There was a Sergeant G.E. Rogers of the United States Coast Artillery traveling on the train with his wife, his 3-year-old son, and his 1-month-old daughter. He and the boy took an upper berth, his wife and the daughter a lower one. When the train wrecked, he and the boy were thrown clear. Somehow his body protected that of his son, and they were able to crawl out of the train. He couldn't find his wife and his baby girl. It was only later, after frantic digging, that their bodies were found. The Cardinals were digging too. Thanks to their spot at the rear of the train, they were thrown around quite a bit and suffered scrapes and bruises, but no serious injuries. Hadn't realized what happened at first, and then slowly they stumbled out of the train, still in their pajamas, pulling on random items of clothing. And as you would expect ball players to do, they jumped in to help with the rescue effort. Rebel Oaks, the center fielder on that team, said, "The cars that had fallen onto the street were piled up like a monster heap of kindlings. Men, women, and children were sticking out of the debris. Some had arms cut off, others were minus legs, in some instances the tops of heads had been crushed. Among the passengers was a man who was returning from the funeral of his sister," Oaks continued. "He was accompanied by his wife, 2 children, and his brother. Only himself and one of the children had escaped. It was pitiful to hear him calling aloud for his wife and children as he dashed about the wreck searching for them." Rube Geyer, a pitcher, said, "I helped to carry out a woman who had 2 boards protruding from her body. Her head was split open. I heard that she died subsequently. One of the toughest sights was that of the little babies, crushed and mangled. There were 14 killed, 47 injured, and the St. Louis Cardinals must have seen most of them. When they finally got into Boston, the game had to be canceled because of how late they showed up. Bresnahan said, 'It was horrible. Horrible. What effect it will have upon the nerve of my men can only be told from their future performance upon the diamond.'" Remember, this is a very hard man in a hard-bitten era. Baseball had that ethic. Everything was a test of your manhood. Everything was about bearing down and gritting your teeth and gutting it out. Wasn't a lot of room for sentiment. But as we now know, traumatic events do have a long-term effect on you sometimes. They move in and they stay. Almost 50 years earlier, Charles Dickens was on a train passing through Staplehurst in Kent. There had been a misunderstanding. A construction crew had removed about 40 feet of track ahead of the train for repairs. That train, too, took a fatal plunge. 7 of 8 first-class cars went over. Dickens was in the 8th. It was turned over. He had to climb out. At the moment, though bruised up some, he was not shaken, and he went about trying to bring aid to people who were badly hurt. He'd cup water in his hat and bring it to them. At least one person died in his arms. He had the presence of mind to remember that he had a copy of the latest chapter of Our Mutual Friend, which he was working on, in his jacket, which had been left behind in the train, and he actually crawled back into the car to get it once everything was over with. It was only later, when he got away from it all, that he broke down. He lost his voice. There wasn't a physiological reason for that. He had no sore throat. It was just a stress reaction. He described himself as shattered. For the rest of his life, he had a problem with trains. He had a problem going everywhere sometimes, even in a horse-drawn carriage. He said, "I have sudden, vague rushes of terror, which are perfectly unreasonable, but quite insurmountable. We call those panic attacks." This man, who was known for not just writing, but for reportage, for traveling, for doing dramatic readings on the stage in front of audiences, couldn't get on a train anymore. Maybe the effects on a ball player wouldn't be too different. Perhaps a week or 10 days after the accident outside of Bridgeport, Bresnahan told a reporter regarding his team's chances, "This may not be a Cardinal year after all." Why would he have said that? They still had something like 60 games to play, and were only 5 games out. The answer was that something had changed. Hans Wagner, the great shortstop, said of Bresnahan, he could do anything. He could catch, pitch, play the infield, or play the outfield. He could hit, throw, and run. I'd say he was the most talented and versatile player in the history of the sport. He was also the Duke of Tralee, as the writers called him, a guy who could never be cowed or intimidated on the field, least of all by umpires. But he could be cowed. He could be intimidated. The Cardinals fell apart in the weeks after the accident, went 33-42 the rest of the way, finished 22 games out. So what can ruin a team's chances in a pennant race? Sometimes all it takes is a ticket to ride in the infinite inning. I'm Stephen Goldman, and this is the Infinite Inning Baseball Podcast. Well, hello there. Hey diddle diddle, the cat and the fiddle, the cow jumped over the moon. She'll be coming down any time now, and her udders are looking very full, so get you deep underground to episode 21. You're too old for nursery rhymes, aren't you? It's very good to be talking to you again. This week I'm joined by David Roth in his usual spot in the batting order. I realize my batting order is not discernible to anyone but me, but it's there, and Cliff, David, and Jesse are all part of it. They all bat cleanup. David and I had the usual wide-ranging conversation. This is kind of hard to describe. It's all about sports and its intersection with the rest of the world and how we regard it and it regards us. Before we get to that, though, I wanted to continue with the theme that I explored in our prologue with another tale of a catcher who might have gotten a little bit lost. The infinite inning is not solely about depression, and depression is not wholly what being in the infinite inning is about, but the two conditions do overlap significantly. In both states, words can operate on two levels, being humorous or pleading or angry, and simultaneously meaning something else altogether. I've often said that having depression is like saying, I want to go home, and you already are home. You joke about wanting the impossible, the contradictory, the quixotic, but it's not a joke. You really want to go home. The tragedy of it is that you're there, and you can't feel being there. It's got me now a little bit, brothers and sisters. It's not unusual for me. It's something I have to deal with on a day-to-day basis, but I'm very fortunate in that at this stage of my career, I am self-supervised, and if necessary, when the black dog has got me pinned to the canvas, I can disappear a little bit. And as long as I meet my deadlines, no one will really notice that I'm gone. I'm not sure what they assume that I'm doing between deadlines. See, the secret of freelancing, for those of you who are going to attempt it in your life, you get the assignment, you go away, and you turn the assignment in, clean and ready to go. You don't trouble your editor with questions or extensions or anything unless it's absolutely necessary. Well, I misspoke slightly there. As someone who has spent many years working as an editor, let me assure you that you never ask for an extension. Extensions are for near-fatal illnesses and deaths in the family. There are no exceptions. So when I'm gone, I guess they assume that I'm working on it or indulging in some hobby, flying kites, perhaps. There's a character in Dickens like that in David Copperfield. He's absolutely nuts, but he flies kites, and that seems to make things better for him. I'm sure some of you who are of similar disposition have a more difficult experience in that you get up each day, you do that gut check, and for whatever reason you've been turned down, the emotional thermostat has been dropped to a cold 40 degrees or something like that, and you still have to go to the cubicle. You still have to report to work. You still have to stand in front of the class and teach it, even though what you really want and need to do is pull the covers up to your nose and never get out again. Imagine being a ball player in that situation, having to go out on that field and perform to your utmost when all you want to do is hide. Well, there have been some. I strongly suspect that Mickey Cochran was one who would have understood what I'm talking about. The player I'm referring to, if you're not familiar with him, he's a Hall of Fame catcher. Kind of an important one. I guess that's encouraging. I'm going to explain why I said that about Cochran, but I need to give you a little background first. Cochran, whose birth name was Gordon, came out of Boston University, rapidly established himself as a top prospect in the minors, and at 22 was a star in the major leagues, hitting .331 for Connie Mack on the 1925 Philadelphia A's. Mack was building a great team, which would win pennants from 1929 through 1931 and won the World Series the first two of those years. And Cochran was a big part of that. In the time that he was with the A's, overall he hit .321, and he had such a great reputation as a team leader that he was voted the AL MVP in 1928, a year in which he only hit .293, and the A's hadn't even won the pennant. They'd finished second to the Yankees. If you are not old enough to have seen Cochran, and I think very few people are at this point, as Casey Stengel said, most of them are dead at the present time. The player today who probably best matches Cochran, at least in output, is Joe Mauer. At least when Mauer was a catcher and playing at his best, in that both were left-handed hitters who emphasized patience and batting average over power. Physically, they weren't similar at all. Cochran was 5'10 and 180 pounds, and Mauer is 6'5 and 225. Although there's one other similarity. Their catching careers ended for broadly similar reasons. I'm not just talking about concussions. Although concussions certainly played a role in the denouement of Cochran's career, there were injuries worse than concussions, and other things, heavier things, going on inside him as well. Connie Mack started to break up his great A's team, the one that had Cochran and Lefty Grove, Jimmy Fox, Al Simmons, Jimmy Dykes. Mack's camera eye Bishop let him not go unmentioned. In the early 1930s, the stock market crash had wiped him out, and the Depression was killing A's ticket sales, and he was of the opinion that the Philadelphia fans were taking his team for granted anyway, so he began selling players off for cash. A whole bunch of them went to the Red Sox, but not Cochran. In December of 1933, he was traded to the Detroit Tigers for a fringe catcher named Johnny Pasek and $100,000. And it should be obvious from the way I said that the $100,000 was the important part. It was a good break for Cochran in that he always wanted to be a manager, and the owner, Frank Navin, was in the market for one. He had actually just tried to make Babe Ruth the manager because the Yankees were done with Ruth and they were looking for ways to kind of palm him off on somebody else, and they knew he wanted to manage. They also knew he wasn't going to be the Yankees manager, both because familiarity breeds contempt and because they really liked Joe McCarthy, and properly so. So they tried to broker a marriage between Navin and Ruth, but Ruth blew Navin off, and Navin decided not to wait, and it was a mistake that would haunt Ruth for the rest of his life. So Cochran became player manager, and in his first season with the team, the Tigers won the pennant, their first since 1909, and Cochran hit .320, picked up his second MVP award at a time when guys mostly didn't win second MVP awards. There was just a prejudice. It's as if Tom Hanks would only get to win one Best Actor award ever for Forrest Gump or something, and then the Academy was forced by rule to ignore Philadelphia or vice versa. Cochran's on-field leadership manifested itself in a really intense approach. It wasn't always positive intensity. On one occasion with the A's, he was catching lefty Rube Wahlberg, and Wahlberg was struggling. Cochran ran out to the mound. Regular mound conference, right? But no, he grabbed Wahlberg by the shoulders, spun him around so he faced center field, and kicked him in the ass. And then he went back behind the plate. Cochran's nickname was Black Mike. Some sources will tell you that this is supposed to reflect the color of his hair, which, to be honest, if you look at pictures, it's about as black as hair can possibly be. It is midnight on top of his head, but I think it also reflected his moods. Cochran was fortunate enough, both because of his own play and because of his teammates, to play in 5 World Series. The postseason was always really hard on him. In the 1931 World Series between the A's and the Cardinals, St. Louis's rookie center fielder Pepper Martin, who we've got to talk about more another time, hit .500, and he stole 5 bases in 6 attempts. And the A's lost in 7 games. And Cochran, as the A's catcher, was very much the GOAT of that series, although the A's lost for all kinds of reasons. Still, as sometimes happens, the fans just pick somebody to be the GOAT. The game of that series that left the most visceral impression was the second game, in that the A's lost that one 2-0, both on runs manufactured by Martin's base running. That game was also a 3-hit shutout by Bill Hallahan, so it's hard to say that all the blame was on the catcher. I mean, if you don't score, you could lose 1-0, 10-0, 100-0. It's all the same damn thing. All the runs after the first run are just gravy. They're redundant. Even though it shouldn't have all been on Cochran, he was ailing. He was distracted. He was trying to stave off the landlord because a bank failure had just wiped out his savings. It was the Great Depression, after all. And 2 years earlier, the stock market crash had wiped him out too, just like Connie Mack. Even if you throw that in, though, the pitchers played a role in allowing the stolen bases. They just weren't set up for it back then. It wasn't a base-stealing time. And Cochran also wasn't the one who allowed Pepper Martin to get 12 hits. Cochran was so exhausted during that series, which, remember, he's both catching and managing. He played during the day, and he spent his nights in the hospital. The Tigers won another pennant in 1935, and this time they beat the Cubs in 6 games for the first championship in team history. And as far as I know, Cochran got through all of that in good shape. No stolen base problems, no running back and forth to the hospital. But, and this is the problem with life, it doesn't freeze frame like the end of a 1970s sitcom. There's always another season. On June 4th, 1936, the Tigers were playing the A's in Philadelphia. The game was scoreless in the top of the third when the Tigers started pounding away at the A's starter, Gordon Rhodes. Cochran got to hit twice in that inning. The first time around, he walked to load the bases with no outs and then scored on Charlie Gehringer's single. 2 pitching changes later, the Tigers are still going, having scored 6 runs, and when Cochran came up again, the bases were again loaded. The pitcher was now a fella named Stuart McGuire Flythe, whose brief career in the majors includes just 39.1 innings, in which he issued 61 walks and, that year, a league-leading 16 wild pitches. This was a special guy. Improbably, Flythe actually threw a pitch in the strike zone, and Cochran lined it to right center field, and it reached the wall, and it bounced away from center fielder Wally Moses. 3 runs scored, and Cochran did too, an inside-the-park grand slam. We just saw one of those this year with the Nationals. He crossed the plate, stumbled to the dugout, and collapsed, though not wholly from the exertion of rounding the bases. "I don't know what happened," he said later. "I started to go to bat, but was suddenly seized by a dizzy feeling. Then my heart started beating at a rapid rate, and I thought I was going to die." This is what we now call a panic attack. He'd been hospitalized for this reason before during the 1934 World Series. After this attack, he benched himself. He tried to manage for a few days, but when he tried to do a little running to see if he was up to getting back in the lineup, all those symptoms returned. "The heart fluttering scares me half to death," he said. He returned to Detroit, checked into the hospital, and they diagnosed him with a hyperthyroid condition. But everybody knew there was something else going on as well. Jimmy Dykes, his old teammate, the manager of the White Sox, said, "If Mickey had our troubles, he'd wind up the Zion check of the American League." Dykes, who never won anything, always thought he was funnier than he was, and this is an example of a joke in bad taste. Zion-check refers to Congressman Marion Zion-check, who had just jumped out of a fifth-floor window the previous August following a nervous breakdown. In the hospital, Cochran was allowed no visitors except his wife, no newspapers or radio, no baseball. Thyroid treatment doesn't require that. You do not get handled so gingerly. After 10 days in the hospital, he was sent away to recuperate on a Wyoming ranch. And again, if you think Wyoming is remote now, imagine it in the days before cell phones and satellite coverage. This was exile from all stress. This is nothing to do with your thyroid gland. He was away about 10 weeks out there on that ranch, finally returning to the team in August, though he barely played. He got into a total of 44 games that season. Given an offseason, he seems to have recovered. In 1937, he was back as the catcher-manager. He played well. He was hitting .306 through 27 games, but on May 25th, the Tigers were playing the Yankees in New York. Bump Hadley was on the mound for the Yankees. Cochran had homered earlier in the game. Another inside-the-park job. A very patient hitter, he worked the count to 3-1. The next pitch was way inside, up and in. It was not, as is sometimes reported, a beanball. Cochran recognized it was a ball, and he was taking all the way. Somehow, though, and he confirmed this later, he just stopped seeing the ball as it was closing in on him. He threw up his arm to defend himself, and he fell away, but the ball just kept homing in on him. It knocked him out. Next time anybody heard from Cochran, it would be in St. Elizabeth Hospital after hours of unconsciousness. The ball hit his right temple, just over the right eye. It fractured his skull in 3 places. The impact was audible up in the press box. One of the fractures went almost all the way around his skull. Another laced through his right sinus. There was some question as to whether he would live. The question wasn't so much internal bleeding or pressure, but the sinus fracture meant that infection might set in. While he was still in danger, his wife flew in by plane from Detroit to New York. She arrived at the hospital after 1 a.m. Cochran was sort of awake now. "Can I get you anything?" she said. "Yeah," he said. "A new head." Cochran wanted to play, but the Tigers said no, it was too dangerous, and although he attempted to manage, his heart wasn't in it, and his on-field career was over. I'm left, though, with the idea of Black Mike in that exchange with his wife. "Can I get you anything?" "Yeah, a new head." No doubt he meant it the way he said it at the moment, but given the contours of his life, the way that stress affected him, it applied the other way, too. Change out my personality. Make me new. And sure, his head hurt as well, but that was transient. The other stuff, the Black Mike stuff, that was permanent. I'll be back with David Roth in just a moment. If you've ever listened to George Harrison's 1971 concert for flood relief in Bangladesh, which is an appropriate thing for us to be talking about just now, when he's about to wrap the concert, bring on the cleanup hitter who's going to just sock this appeal to charity home, he says, "I'd like to introduce a friend of us all, Mr. Bob Dylan." Well, I don't have Bob Dylan here, but I do think what a great way to introduce a friend of us all, Mr. David Roth. How are you, David?
I'm good, man. I really appreciate that.
Well, you know, you are such a multifarious and good-hearted person. I think it seems appropriate. I think that's what Harrison was talking about, as opposed to like thinking, well, he's the guy who first got the Beatles on drugs, and that makes him a friend of himself.
I was going to say, like all the things that you always often hear associated with Bob Dylan: a friend, like a warm man, a nice fellow. Like, I'll take it. But is he actually supposed to be a nice guy? I had not heard that.
No, I don't know that he was, and I don't know that. I mean, John Lennon wasn't either, and neither was Gandhi, you know. But you take the sort of the broader outreach part of it, I guess.
Yeah, no, and I will take it. I mean, if this is like in some associative way, me getting a compliment from you by way of George Harrison or George Harrison by way of you, like whatever, I'm into it.
Excellent.
So yeah, hi, how are you? I'm good. I'm doing okay. I hope you're well too.
To shift awkwardly to something much heavier than a 1971 flood relief concert, the day that I'm talking to you is 9/11. It is the anniversary of the attacks on New York and the Pentagon and the plane crash in Pennsylvania. And you published something today, or republished it, that you had written about 6 years ago about this. And it's on Medium. If you go to medium.com at David J. Roth _J_Roth, you'll find it. And I recommend it. And I'm just going to read this passage from towards the end. I'm going to paraphrase it just slightly so it works out of context. But the army of the terrified demanded a permanent September 12th, and they have it. We have taken up residence in that long shadow, lived in and with the frantic inertia, the intermittent intimations of something terrible, the inward-turning fear at all those vague but implacable loomings. A new political class of howling, shit-scared know-nothing bullies that believes the only tough-minded response to anything is an unyielding no. A popular culture curled babyish around an atomizing and anomic materialism it detests and knows well it cannot afford, 1,000 inexpressible and unexpressed fears and mistrusts. How we live now is a disheartening extension of who we were then. Is that still true 6 years later?
I was thinking when I was reading back over it that I think some parts of it actually seem kind of quaint. Like, I think that things have in many ways gotten worse. I think that part, I don't know how you get worse than what I was trying to express there, but I would say it feels about the same. It was weird. I mean, it seems like especially in sort of 2011, like it was not a great time. And yet like we felt, I think, a lot less close to the edge than we do now, or maybe just I did. But yeah, it was disheartening. I think the part of it that felt most dated or most quaint to me was all the stuff about Glenn Beck that's in the piece, just because he's not really a factor in the discourse or the, or culture broadly speaking anymore. And he seems like obviously he was gross in a lot of different ways, and I think has in him a lot of the DNA of some of the, what's happened to the right sort of nationalist movement that we're dealing with now. But he seems like, he's just like a carny barker. Like, he seems like a much more innocent figure than the Steve Bannons and stuff of the world that have come around and replaced him.
To just touch on the way that this crosses over into sports 6 years on, no sport, I think, has wrapped itself in 9/11 as much as baseball. It's a weird juxtaposition, I think, and I'm going to bring the NFL into this too. It's a strange thing where we're supposed to go to Yankee Stadium, and at the seventh inning stretch, this canned version of God Bless America plays, this woman who's long dead singing this mono recording from God knows when, and you're supposed to stand and be moved into patriotic fervor or remembrance or something by this echo from the past. There's nobody there. You're not standing for anything or to anyone. It's just this kabuki knee-jerk thing. And then
it's such a weird, that particular recording too has always felt so kitschy to me that like there's still that use of it. I don't mind. I like the song well enough. It's just like that particular is like a real Yankee Stadium vibe to me. Anyway, I interrupted you, but
the contrast I was going to draw is that as we're talking also just after the NFL season has begun and Colin Kaepernick is unemployed, and it's obvious that a big reason, look, he hasn't performed exceptionally well, but a reason that he's not qualified to even be a backup on an NFL team is because of this national anthem stance that he's taken and that other people have emulated. And it's weird because there's somebody who's actually, agree with him or not, and I'm not endorsing or not endorsing that position, but that's not important right now. What I'm saying is he's asking you to engage with patriotism in a real way. And then at the same time, you have this artificial way, and that's perfectly acceptable, but actually kind of grappling with it is too harsh for us.
That part of it, I think, is the thing that stands out to me. It's the most objectionable to it. I mean, like the NFL itself, aesthetically, politically, in terms of the quality of the actual on-field product, there's a lot to object to. And I assume that I will continue to do that every couple of weeks as long as people ask me to do it. I feel like I'm at this point certainly recycling phrases and stuff. But to me, that particular response to it, the idea that like he's being blackballed out of spite by a league in which I'd say maybe a third of the teams are starting quarterbacks that are far inferior to him. And he's not a great player. I mean, I think he has been a very, very good player at times in even the recent past, but it's just, there's something to it. I mean, this like that weird umbrage at being asked to hear his views or consider his views or in any way sort of problematize the experience of going through these familiar rituals at a sporting event. I understand, I suppose in an abstract way, how people disagree with what he's saying or what he stands for or whatever. I don't understand reacting that violently to the simple request to consider another perspective.
I mean, Michael Vick got to play again.
The NFL is full of mutants. I mean, it's just like, and there's something like inherently, I don't think, gross about the NFL, but I mean, if the culture of football is perverse, it has been for a really long time. A lot of these people have been getting away with stuff or been sort of coddled, or in other ways, like none of that totally applies to somebody that gives away a bunch of their labor as a college athlete for a bunch of years. But I think there's a great deal of entitlement on both sides of things. But I sure have come in recent years to see the version of entitlement that the owners display as being by far the more perverse of the two.
Since you brought up your thoughts on the NFL, we'll sort of take a turn into that for a moment, because among the things that you've published recently is a piece on Victory Journal about the NFL, getting used to it, it's called. And if I understood your thesis correctly, it's that the actual football part of the NFL is not very good, and that while there's a lot of posturing around the politics of the NFL, be it, as you said, the mutants who are allowed or not allowed to play on kind of an arbitrary basis, some are made examples of, some are tolerated indefinitely, and there's a lot of additional posturing, whether it's around concussions or things like that, that the actual sports of it has declined.
I think the quality of it has declined. I also think the importance of it seems in some weird way to have declined. I mean, I think quality of play comes and goes in sports. I mean, football it's an extremely difficult game as as the players have become faster and stronger than they've ever been before. I think finding suitable talent, it becomes more difficult. But I think that there's also this sense, to me, it's not that like there may not be 30 plus really good quarterbacks. We know very well that there are not. I mean, right now there's maybe 3 that would qualify as exceptional. What's striking about it to me is to see teams that are not tanking in some structured way, but just have entered the season without any hope, obviously without hope. And in many cases, overtly aware of the fact that they are missing very important pieces. They've made no attempt to redress that. Like, that's a fucking weird thing to do. Like, in some ways, it's kind of like this perverse swagger move on the owner's part, just to be like, yeah, our team stinks. And also season ticket prices have gone up. And like, just the idea of being, like, what else are people going to watch? Like, it's a power play, but it's also like, at another more basic level, it's a dick move. It's like a real abdication of what I think is sort of the responsibility that a sports owner has. They get to make all kinds of money. They get to start out with all kinds of money. But the team is something like a public good, so give the people something to watch, like how hard is that? And yet it seems like I don't think that there's a great sense of responsibility on the part of really any owners in the NFL, not just like social responsibility in terms of what do you do when you have more money than you or anyone related to you could ever spend. But in terms of that basic responsibility of like, if you're going to ask people to pay all this money for personal seat licenses, don't make them watch the fucking 49ers. That particular piece, I feel like, echoed a lot of other stuff to the point where I was kind of unsure about it when I was writing it, because I really do feel like I've been saying the same sort of thing for years. But the owners continue to get weirder. The product continues to get worse. It's not my fault that I'm right, Stephen.
Would you feel better about it if the New York market was better served? Because, I mean, the Giants are usually at least representative, but the Jets have long since passed a nadir of not just incompetence, but something way worse than that. There's
Oh
something
yeah,
chronically ill about that franchise, and it doesn't matter who the owner is, who the coach is, who the general manager is, and this year may be the worst year of all.
yeah. Oh, I think they are perverse in a way that other teams are not this year because they are both tanking and yet do not appear to have done any of the necessary work that you would need to do to justify a tank. I mean, the Browns aren't great either, but they have a ton of draft picks. The Bills are, can't tell exactly what they're doing, but they have 2 picks in each of the first 3 rounds next year. It's fantastic. The Jets got rid of all their good players, replaced them with less good players, made no transactions to stockpile picks for the future, made no real moves that I can tell put them on a footing for that. It's just like they just sort of decided that they were going to sit this year out. It's one thing to acknowledge that you're not going to make the playoffs or whatever, but in the past, I've kind of thought, I grew up as a Giants fan just because, that was what my dad was. And the Giants, I think, they've been better on balance, but they've also been very stodgy. They take themselves very seriously. And the Jets have been goofier and at times I think more fun just in terms of the fact that they've had these incredibly overstated dirt bags at the center of like some of their, not even their best teams, but I mean that like Mark Gastineau doing like the ravishing Rick Rude thing or like employing Rex Ryan for a long time, just keeping him off the streets and letting him wander North Jersey all like horned up and driving some giant sport utility vehicle. That stuff is in some ways like I admire that because it doesn't really matter to me if they win or lose. They might as well be interesting. At this point, they seem, a few years away in either direction from even trying to do that.
One of the things that's interesting to me, and it's interesting in both baseball and football, is that in the earlier days of baseball, when baseball was trying to establish itself as the national pastime, and even later, if an owner did this tanking thing for more than a very short period of time, if they showed signs of just being chronically ineffectual, eventually the leagues would get together and say, look, you're hurting us. You need to either fix this or sell because it doesn't do us. And at that time it was, 1/8 of a league or 1/16 of the major leagues. It's not good for us to have a hole where a team is intended to be.
Yeah.
And it's confusing to me with the Marlins and the Rays because that's a lot of non-tickets being sold as part of a major league schedule in each league, for example. And I'm not sure why those things, and this is not an insult to the fans of those teams who are very dedicated, there just aren't enough of them in ways that make the turnstile spin. So why should a league let that situation persist? Why should a league allow the ownership of the Browns to go on year after year after year, or let the owner of the Jets apparently be more interested in picking up an ambassadorship from the current presidential administration than putting a good team on the field?
It's weird. The NFL, I think, and this is what makes it both interesting to write about and then also extremely difficult to write about in a way that does not reiterate the same points you've been making, since 2009, is that I think that there is this sense of solidarity in the league among the owners that I think is unique. That like they see this as being like they think of themselves. I mean, this is the famous Tex Schramm line to Gene Upshaw during one of the early NFLPA owner negotiations was, "You are the cattle, we are the ranchers." They see themselves as being like not again the trustees of some sort of like public good or whatever. I think in some cases maybe they do. I always thought the Rooneys took what the Steelers mean to Pittsburgh very seriously, just for one instance. But I think in a lot of these other cases, they are loyal to themselves and to their individual bottom lines and their collective bottom line, and that really the rest of it kind of means fuck all to them. And when you see how that manifests, I mean, like, this is the league that would result from that. Like, if you really aren't emphasizing anything but getting the best possible returns on investment, if it doesn't concern you to be alienating fans, putting out an inferior product, ignoring problems that structurally could lead to the end of your sport within a generation or two. If none of that matters to you, then like you're going to get exactly what you deserve. And we're going to get a league that reflects how little you value anything but, continuing to make the most money in the present.
Steve here, interrupting to alert you to an incoming commercial break. listening back to this one, I realized the theme is empathy. I think the theme of this whole series is empathy. Baseball and empathy. And we'll have heaps more empathy right after this word from our sponsors. You know what I worry about, and at the risk of turning this into a football podcast when at the beginning of the show I say this is a baseball podcast, is...
That's kind of a boring part of the baseball season. It's not your fault.
It is not the best baseball season at all, with a lot of teams that seem like the 1927 Yankees rowing backwards violently right now.
Yeah.
But what I fear is going to happen, and this has happened in a more benign way in baseball, is that fewer and fewer Americans are going to play football because they want to retain their brain cells for as long as they possibly can in their lives. And that the NFL at that point will discover Latin America, or it will discover other impoverished countries that happen to have big guys in them. And then suddenly we'll start seeing overseas NFL academies, and they will be bringing in cheaper guys from other countries where the possibility of poverty is so strong that the incentive to play, concussion or not, is minimized.
Yeah. And then you're in really dark territory there. I mean, that is like the teams are basically Foxconn or whatever, just like sort of relocating wherever through the global south they can find the readiest and cheapest supply of human resources.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
I would say that I don't have a hard time believing any of that, except for the fact that no one likes football outside of the United States and maybe Canada, so it would be hard to do that. Like, I think that, with baseball, I think you definitely can sort of see that, and I think that there's this conflict within baseball because of the fact that it has this image of itself as the purest Americana, like a game that is as big-hearted as the country itself, or blah, blah, blah. And they really have outsourced a great deal of their labor to people that they can pay as little as possible and exploit to the greatest possible degree. I think the NFL has that too. It's just it happens within the United States. I mean, that it's and if that's what the league winds up being, if it winds up continuing along the trend that it's in now, where the quarterbacks are rich kids with extremely ambitious parents who've been coached in a very specific way since they were in their early teens, and then everybody else is from some sort of desolate community in Texas or Florida or whatever, SEC country. It could be good football. I don't think that that's workable in the long run. I think especially the damage that's inherent in it, as that becomes clearer and more widely understood, it's going to be harder to get people to look past it. Not just fans, but the people that play it as well.
Well, that's an ugly thing because, again, and I'm not the only one to observe this. I mean, heck, Bill James pointed out, and you can chart this for yourself, about how it's always the economic underclass that plays the most sports. And you can see waves of immigration in United States history reflected in the names of the ball players. So in certain eras, they were all German and Irish, and then suddenly you start seeing Italian names and Jewish names and so on. And then when integration finally happened, and then there was that. But what you're doing if you're in a sport that harms the people who play it is you're in Jonathan Swift eat the poor territory.
Right. I think that's a really important distinction with this as well. Because with baseball, you can see the way that the game is globalized as being I think it's beneficial. I think it reflects a bunch of really good things about the sport. The idea that there are different ways to play the game in different cultures that all have a sort of unique and individuated appeal. And then I think baseball is more fun for having these different types of people in it. Absolutely. I think it's cooler. I think it's more expressive and more interesting than when I was a kid. And I think it's going to continue along that trend, I hope. It's just a question of whether the league can sort of get out of its own way with it. I think that to the extent that any of this is a threat, it's a threat to people that have a lot invested in the idea of baseball as something that is a nostalgia product. That reflects a vision of America that's kind of, obviously some people still cling to it, but that is in most ways dated and exclusive. To the extent that baseball does not turn backwards like that, I think it'll be a lot healthier. I think that football, just by its nature, is even more backward looking, and I think in a sort of a different and maybe darker sort of way than baseball is. I just wish every league could be more like the NBA and just fucking get over itself. Honestly, I think that would do everybody so much good.
Well, how do you mean that? Since I'm relatively basketball ignorant. So how has the NBA done that?
I mean, I think in some ways it's just by allowing the players to sort of express themselves. I mean, I think that owners, it's not like the sort of thing where it's a peaceable kingdom. I mean, that like basically LeBron James being both the best player, certainly of his era and possibly ever, and then also being like a guy with a political conscience and a sort of a willingness to go get what he wants. That has changed the NBA so much. I mean, it's the lockout, salary cap rules, all of this stuff is reflective of owners trying to tamp down on that. But there's only so much you can really do. And I think that like the NBA, the players who are, not to belabor the point, like they're the labor and they are also the product, that like that group, I think, is self-actualized and understands its power in a way that other leagues don't as much. I think there's rumblings of that in the NFL post-Kaepernick of players, I think, sort of realizing not just that they have a voice, but that like if enough of them use it, you can't tell them to shut up. And I think it would be really exciting to see the NFL do that. It's been the weakest union in pro sports for as long as that union has existed. And they have done some really shameful capitulating in years past. It would be nice to see that trend change, especially given how much is at stake, in terms of the people's lives.
And if they were a real union, I'm setting a high bar here, but it shouldn't just be Colin Kaepernick. It shouldn't just be the odd Michael Bennett. It should be all of them or most of them. There should be a solidarity there so that whether you agree with Colin Kaepernick's opinion on matters, you're defending his right to say it and his right to work regardless of what his opinions or affiliations are.
And I think that there is, to a certain extent, that is beginning to happen. I mean, the example that I was thinking of was the Cleveland Browns. The default there is reactive, right? That like the owner is not a very forward-thinking man. And I think that the NFL ownership community in general wants very much players to speak when spoken to, and maybe not even then, and just generally to sort of be quiet. Hugh Jackson, their coach, was talking about how he didn't want anybody that would protest the flag on his roster. And like then 12 guys on the team kneeled. They did some sort of unity thing with the cops on their opening day, everybody linking arms and stuff. And I'd love to believe that it was as simple as that. But something about those players, I mean, some of them, there was a white player, the first white player to join that protest in like that meaningful way, like was among them. Those guys just basically putting out there that they knew that they could do this and that if enough of them did it, then nobody could get them not to do it. Like that is as good a development as any that we've seen. I mean, I think I'd love to see more of it, and I'd love to see it not just in terms of matters of social justice or whatever, but it's less important, but in terms of these guys standing up for themselves. I think the future of the sport in a very real way depends on that. I think it depends on making owners realize their responsibility to future generations of people that will play and people that are playing now in terms of taking care of them because of the damage that's inherent in the game. I think if they don't do that, it could really all go away.
And it would be a real social good to make people confront that, because you and I have both had and experienced and talked to the compartmentalization that consumers of sports want, the whole stick to sports thing. But these players can't stick to sports because they are people outside of the game, outside of the field. They are, in some cases, they're African Americans. And again, like people disagree with their reaction to it or their of it, but you can't just deny it.
Right.
And I mean, I personally am supportive of it. And I understand that some people have a certain tolerance for protests and others don't. Fine. But you can't just say, no, it's not a real thing and pretend it doesn't exist. Well, those guys who kneel are making you think about that. In baseball, we have a sport that is populated to a great extent by immigrants, and that many of the Hall of Fame players are first-generation Americans or second-generation Americans. There was an article in Life magazine, and this is something, by the way, that I'm going to get into in the show with a guest a couple of weeks hence, but there was an article in Life magazine in the 30s about Joe DiMaggio, about how his family only spoke Italian at home. And
oh man,
you're going to tell me you know this one.
No, I just know it because I couldn't believe that you put this in a piece that you wrote for me when I was at Vice, and I could not believe the shit that was in it. Go ahead and read it.
Well, I don't have it in front of me, but the upshot of it was that he now prefers chow mein to spaghetti and combs his hair with grease instead of olive oil or something.
The bit that I remember from it was that he smells not at all of garlic.
Yeah, exactly. That's how provincial things
Who would
were.
have thought? Yeah.
He was born here, but imagine if he wasn't. Imagine if his parents had just brought him at some point. Are we going to disavow Joe DiMaggio at that point? What I don't understand, what I cannot get my head around, David, no matter what I do, is that in a ballpark on any given night around this country, there are many, many people who are cheering for the guys in their team's uniform who were not born here, who will then leave the ballpark and go to Facebook and say immigrants out.
I think that some of it is just, there's that one level of abstraction. It's that belief that there is such a thing as sticking to sports, or that there's like some way in which sports exist in a world that's like parallel to ours, populated by people that look sort of like buffer versions of ourselves, maybe with more tattoos, but that like are otherwise not real. That like as soon as the game is over, they just fucking power down like C-3PO and you wake them up for batting practice the next day. And that's just like, I don't know how an adult sustains that. When I was a kid, that was, definitely something that I thought. And I remember with the 86 Mets, that was like, I was 8 years old. That was the first real, I think, time that I had to confront the fact that these guys they weren't like me. They weren't my friends, that they would like get in fights at bars, like that they were like maybe actually dicks, that like in many cases they had pretty serious problems, adult, like grown up style problems.
Huge ones. Yeah.
Yeah, huge ones. And that I don't know how you make it into adulthood, assuming that these guys are just like not real people that move through the real world. Their experience of that world is different. Because of their wealth, or because of their color, or because of the general parlousness of their existence as immigrants in a country that's having an anti-immigrant moment. But all of this seems to boil down to not just an unwillingness to engage with the reality of other people's lives or what's complicated about them, but I think just like people are offended at being asked to consider it. I think that that's the thing with the anthem protests or whatever, the way that NFL teams and I think a lot of NFL fans have responded to it, is that I think that if you were to ask them, straight up, do you think that people of color are treated the same way by police that white people are? Do you think that those communities are policed in the same way? I'm sure they would tell you no. But I think that it's having to think about it is the thing that bugs them, that somehow that they're the victims or the real put upon ones in this, because it's like they're just trying to watch the 49ers lose by 3 touchdowns to the Seahawks. And this guy is sitting down, and now you have to think about the fact that police never get punished for shooting people.
But too bad. That's his only opportunity to put that in front of you.
Right. And also, you don't have the fucking right not to think about that.
Right.
This idea of the safe space as a sort of, especially, the way that it's been sort of more at this point, I think, weaponized by people on the right as an idea of a way of attacking people for cowardice or whatever. I think that everybody wants a safe space. Everybody on both sides would love to not be bothered by shit, because life is stressful and it's not always fun to have to consider a lot of this stuff. And yet at the same time, that's not the way that it works. It's not the world that we live in. You don't get to be that way when you're an adult.
This is maybe an inapt analogy, but I'm more offended by Donovan McNabb making 200 chunky soup commercials and trying to sell me this sodiumized industrial crap in a can than I am Colin Kaepernick trying to make me empathize with other human beings.
Oh, yeah. Or, with any of that stuff, it's like the idea of that you're willing to accept idiocy or insult to your intelligence from this stuff, with Peyton Manning mumbling through some sort of jingle or whatever. But that the second that someone reminds you that their life off the field is not exactly how you might imagine it to be, you decide that you can't watch anymore. Whatever. Again, people can do you with whatever, but it's just that seems awfully childish to me. I don't have a lot of respect for it at all. As you might have gathered by the fact that I've been saying the same thing for 25 minutes.
You've said the NFL thing in other contexts in other places, but it's worth revisiting because, we always say baseball is a microcosm of American society. Well, in this instance, whatever the hell is dysfunctional there is a microcosm of our society too.
That was something that my friend Tom Kaiser, who's also a talented sports writer about movies as well, I think mostly as a joke, but not entirely as a joke, tweeted yesterday that on Sunday that the actual appeal of the NFL is that it feels so much like 2017. That people watch it because they don't want to be interrupted. That they just, it's like if suddenly a sports programming thing blew up onto a cable news channel that you were watching, but tonally it's exactly the same. It just happens to like involve sports instead of like two guys from opposite sides of the issue talking over each other.
All right, wait. Well, that's true of baseball then too, because this feels like a really mediocre season, globally speaking. I mean, within the teams, there are some awesome performances and a lot of stuff that's fun to grab onto. But we had this Dodgers team that was winning 70% of their games, and now they can't win any.
Yeah.
And I might be misquoting this stat, but I saw this earlier today that they're now like the first team in history to win 14 of 15 games at one point, but also lose 14 of 15 games at one point.
Yeah.
We had the Astros doing about the same thing, not as long, and they've also been mediocre in the second half. The Cubs are not what they were last year, which was historically great. The Red Sox can't hit, and the Nationals are doing it without Bryce Harper, who skidded his knee over a base and hasn't been around for a while. We had Mike Trout gone for like 40 games. It's a drab season in some ways.
It kind of is. I feel like the playoffs are going to be good, though. Because I think these teams are, like, broadly speaking, there's like, you know, it doesn't help, like you said, that like two of the best teams are like just absolutely falling down a flight of stairs every time a game is played. But, you know, there's 4 or 5 teams that are really excellent, you know, just talent-wise. And I think, like, on balance, once the Dodgers and Astros sort out whatever it is that's ailing them, you know, they are very much among that number. And then, like, those teams playing each other for a month is going to be pretty cool, I think. It's just, again, that there's, like, a lot. It doesn't help for me that, like, the team that I actually care about and root for has been playing exceptionally insignificant baseball since early July.
And that would be the New York Mets. The New York Mets have finally reared their ugly head.
I'm used to watching insignificant baseball. I can find a way to sort of enjoy it in a perverse way, but I think that in recent years I've gotten used to the significant stuff. In this case, it's, you know, just knowing that I have to, like, seek out other teams and other games in order to see baseball worth playing. I think I've probably just watched less as a result of that.
Well, all right. Well, one Mets thing I did want to ask you about.
Oh, no, please don't make me talk about the Mets.
Just one.
All right,
one
fine.
And this is
wafer thin.
Possibly, yeah, exactly. Just one thin mint wafer. This is possibly along the lines of the same kinds of social issues we've been talking about in a way. The best Met lately, not that there's very many other Mets left standing, but in the second half, Jose Reyes has hit .286, slugged .463. He's stolen 10 bases in 13 attempts. He's sort of the old Jose Reyes after a super miserable first half. Now, he's 34. He's can't play defense anymore. And he has, as I alluded to, this thing on his record that makes it very, very uncomfortable to root for him. But I feel like, given this is already a team that has extended Nori Aoki, a guy who hadn't actually played for them at the time that they did that, after he had passed through approximately 26 other organizations this year, I feel like he's coming back.
2 different things on that. Apparently the team is, I think that they would be interested if they didn't have to pay him any money at all, because that's the Mets way. And that's the situation they're in right now, where it's like they keep him on the roster because, like, the Rockies are paying him. So, like, what do you have to worry about? Except for, again, like you said, the extremely odious domestic violence charge. The other thing is, apparently he's beloved in the clubhouse. Like, they see him as, like, a mentor to Ahmed Rosario, who's, you know, a 20-year-old prodigy playing shortstop for a crappy Mets team, which is an experience that Reyes himself had. It's hard to say that they'll bring him back. I think if they could bring him back for the veterans minimum, I think they might. The thing with the Mets that I think if they don't do it, it's going to be less because of any ethical consideration than because of the fact that the only types of players that they have developed on the offensive end in recent years, with the exception of, you know, Rosario, Michael Conforto, and to a lesser degree Dominic Smith, are promising. They develop guys that can't really field at any of 4 positions, that get hits, but, like, they're all singles and, you know, whatever. Like, sometimes they walk, most times they don't. They have a ton of those guys, and all of them will make less than Jose Reyes. So it might be that they're ready to transition to the Phillip Evans administration because of the fact that, like, you know, whatever, Phillip Evans will be making $300,000 next year.
I finally understand the Wilpon philosophy when you said that they'd be interested in bringing Jose Reyes back if they didn't have to pay him, because I'm very interested in owning a Rolex and a Tesla as long as I can get them for free. Yeah. I'm not interested in actually paying for them.
Right. I feel the same way about most of these things. It makes it really easy, especially if you take that approach and you combine it with not actually having very much money, it's really easy to be ethical in a lot of your consumption, because you're just like, well, I don't eat foie gras because it's bad. And then also because, like, I can't afford it, and you have to pay for the sauterne that comes with it and whatever. Like, no thanks, it's fine. Same way that, like, I don't not eat lobster because it's cruel, although I think it is. I only eat lobster because, like, it's a lot, like, mackerel is a lot cheaper.
Right.
So we'll see what the Mets actually do, or whether they actually have any sort of stance on this. I hadn't seen that they extended Aoki. They signed him through next year?
Yes.
Fantastic. That's great. You know who really seems to not be excited about that decision? My anecdotal observation, I think Nori Aoki hates that, from what I've seen. He is playing with the look of a man who just found out that his pet was kidnapped or something. Like, he just looks like he fully, has made a terrible mistake. He's hitting the ball.
He is.
Yeah, but, well, whatever. We'll see. Maybe he'll get used to it. Maybe he'll learn to like New York.
There are certain players, and he's one of them. Alex Presley, who's a journeyman outfielder, presently with the Tigers, is one. He's hitting .309 with the Tigers. He's 31 years old. He's been getting cups of coffee for forever. And if you give Alex Presley 100 at-bats, he will convince you that he would be an awesome regular. It's only when you give him 101 at-bats and up that you realize that he's a highly average or mediocre player.
Yeah.
And I feel like Aoki is often that guy too. Like, for 2-3 weeks at a time, he will give you the impression that he's kind of Ichiro Jr., and then he regresses to the mean, which is
Fukudome minus. Yeah.
Exactly.
But yeah, that is like a perfectly useful type of player to have as a fourth or fifth outfielder, as long as you're not, like, selling yourself some sort of bill of goods and, like, we've got the long side of our platoon settled for only $1 million. Like, that is a very Mets sort of delusion. But I mean, as a, whatever, he's better than Alejandro De Aza. They sold themselves on that one too. So, but yeah, what is the idea? There's some number that I think that the people that talk about this stuff with authority use, that, like, basically any player can, for like a period of 50 at-bats, be the best player in baseball. That, like, anybody that's good enough to make it to the majors can, like, over a certain very limited period, be unstoppable.
I don't know what the term for that is, but it's not unlike what's happening to the Indians and the Dodgers now. It's just it's the Rosencrantz and Guildenstern thing, right? I've cited this a million times. Heads, 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 heads. You're just in a period in which all the odds align in one way, and it proves nothing, and there's nothing long-term to be taken from it. It's just, with certain players, a bunch of line drives land in the right place, and for a week they look like Mickey Mantle, but they're not Mickey Mantle.
That's part of why I'm looking forward to October, I think, is the fact that just by design, we have this, it's an arbitrary length, but it's not a short length over the course of a major league season. So you can generally, over the course of that year, we figure out who the good teams are. And sometimes, you realize that one is more or less lucky than another. So we figure it out. Those good teams get to play in the postseason. And then the postseason is completely the opposite of that. And anything can happen. And teams routinely get this sort of, like, you could get high flown with it, or you could be like that they do, like, the Cornholio Beavis thing where they just suddenly are just like, and, like, just tear through everything. And it doesn't always get you all the way there, but, like, a Cardinals team that won 82 games in the regular season won a World Series. Like, I watched them beat the Mets while they were doing it. That, like, and I think the Royals, well, in, like, 2015, there was this sense that they were probably not quite as good as they seemed. And yet at the same time, if you've watched baseball, know that doesn't really matter. The thing that they had going for them and, like, what they were doing was enough. It was certainly enough to get them through a 7-game series. And when a team is playing like that, there really is a different sort of experience when you're watching it as a fan. You're aware of how arbitrary it all is and how sort of little about the game at some fundamental level, not only do you understand, but, like, is understandable. And that's a real fun thing for me. It's just that you don't get to feel that in August or September. Like, you have to wait till the games are really important.
That is one of my favorite things about the postseason. And as you were talking about that, I was just thinking about, this is really random, but Nelson Cruz, who's the outfielder DH with the Mariners, in 2011, he was with the Rangers playing the Tigers in the ALCS. And he's a really good hitter. He's a guy who's going to finish his career with, he's already got 300, maybe 400 home runs, something like that. He's not Babe Ruth or anything. But in this particular 6-game series, he hit 6 home runs. He hit 364 with 6 home runs. He drove in 13 runs again in 6 days. If you did that over the course of the regular season, you'd break every record in the books into and it's just possible because you're getting this snapshot of heat. And next series that year in the World Series, he hit 200.
Right. And this is the part of it that makes it so fun if you watch it for enough years, is that you can fill a whole roster out of guys like that. And some of them, it's Nelson Cruz or David Ortiz or Carlos Beltran, or really good players that are suddenly in God mode. But then there's also these other guys, there's Buddy Biancalana, or there's, people that for a brief postseason turn into a player that they have never been before and will never be again.
World Series MVP Pat Borders.
Yeah, hell yeah. I wrote something about Ray Ordonez at Vice months ago. And I remember going back and looking at Al Weiss's postseason. Al Weiss was the second baseman, shortstop sort of combo dude on the 69 Mets team. And he won the Babe Ruth Award that year, which was most valuable player of the playoffs. Right. And his career ended 86 games later. Like, he was never even acceptable again. He was barely acceptable before that. And yet, even Al Weiss, that is the example that I think of.
The really famous example of that is that in the 1947 World Series, the Yankees pitcher, Bill Bevins, took a no-hitter into the ninth. He had walked a whole bunch of guys, and he was just kind of hanging in there. And Cookie Lavagetto broke up the no-hitter and drove in both the tying and winning runs. And it was this massive upset. And it was Bevins's last pitch in the major leagues, and it was Cookie Lavagetto's last at bat in the major leagues.
This is getting me really excited to watch meaningful baseball, dude. Because this, I'm right now, the idea that I have a great conversation with Steve, make myself dinner, and then I just am watching a drowsy Robert Gazelman give up 5 consecutive doubles for the Mets. Just fuck, man. When do I get the good stuff?
There's something antithetical about a drowsy Gazelman. It's you need a different animal name.
You need a bounding Gazelman. But yeah, right. It's not his style.
I want to ask about 2 other things that you wrote real fast. This is sort of a baseball thing. You took the cliche Twitter ratio and you started interpreting it in terms of the old stats. This is before we have these slash stats, but what used to be in the Sunday papers every week: batting average, home runs, and RBIs. And now I know, and I'm still laughing about this, when a tweet is so unpopular that it has reached the standards of Lyle Overbay has been designated for assignment.
Which is basically, if you think about what his numbers would look like when that happens, it's 210, 5, 29.
Can you explain for people real fast the idea behind it?
Yeah, so the way that if you were to look at a tweet on your desktop, it will show you the number of responses that it gets, the number of retweets that it gets, and the number of likes that it gets. And, the ratio itself is the idea of it, which I guess Luke O'Neill codified, but I think people had understood before that, was that if a tweet is really, really bad, it will have nobody co-signing it and a million people saying, don't ever tweet again, seriously, please. Usually if a tweet is if it's by a high profile person, or in the rare instance when it's by a low profile person, but so unbelievably shitty that it does crazy numbers, you see stuff where it's it gets 1,500 responses, 5 retweets. There's these things happen. But the ones that I was thinking about with the slash line thing, which I started realizing by accident months ago, and I had been meaning to write about it, and then Deadspin finally let me do it, was the idea a tweet, usually by some political commentator type, or sometimes a politician, that on its way to achieving that 8,000 responses, 100 retweets ratio, briefly stops over at various baseball Triple Crown lines. And some of them top out there. The one that was the funniest to me was Bill James had a bad tweet about Adolf Hitler that I watched all day as it went from being you could see that it was bad. And when I first looked at it, it was 50 responses, 2 retweets. And I was this could happen. This might have what it takes. And it kind of topped out at Pete Kozma, which was maybe 191 to 28. And you're just sort of I can sort of see it. And the idea of it being Bill James that's responsible for that, the guy that tried to get us to think beyond those stats, and then he's out there going Cosmo with his shitty tweet, is, I found there was a pleasing sort of circular shape to that.
This is another discussion, but this is a guy who has been so important to my life and career. And he's not somebody I know. I've interacted with him on a few occasions, very, very casually and at a distance, and we have some friends in common. But his work changed my life. And yet, when he does something like that, and I mean, it's hypocritical of me to tell Bill James to stick to sports. I'm not telling anybody to stick to sports. Sometimes he just fires those off, and it's sort of ill thought out. So as funny as that aspect of things was, it was also a little painful for me to see him there.
Oh, for me too. I mean, I think he had, a less sort of, just given when I came up in it. But of course, anybody that cares about baseball, Bill James, made your life better. It's just that I think he's so brilliant, and then also so incapable of being embarrassed, from as far as I can tell, that it's just like, if that thought pops into his head, he's just sort of like, I just had a good thought about Adolf Hitler, and I would love to share that with my followers. Whereas I think a lot of people would, maybe in that moment before you open the little, field to start typing, you would think, actually, no, don't do that.
Some of the best tweets that I have deleted before tweeting, because the consequences of it, if it were misunderstood or didn't land quite right, seemed to me not worth the effort.
No, I think that's certainly true. I think that's part of how this stuff works. And I think in many ways it's salutary that the idea of it's not going to say I don't have opinions on Beyonce or whatever, but they're not important to me enough that I want to share them, and then have a million people that I don't know who really care about Beyonce yelling at me about them. That's just I have to make that decision. So I'll keep them to myself.
So where do we go with the ratio? Is it just something for us to be aware of going forward?
It doesn't seem significant, even in the way that Twitter can sort of seem significant, but I think it adds something to the sort of the experience of watching it. A lot of times if you catch people retweeting a bad tweet early, you can know to sort of check in on it every now and then. I did that with when I was doing the piece, that there'd be one that you could see sort of getting at early, and it doesn't look like a batting line yet. It's just 102 and 4 or something like that. And you're like, all right, so that's Bartolo Colon's career batting lines. But the idea of being able to just sort of file that away in your head and be I'm going to check on this in an hour, and I bet that it looks like Glenn Allen Hill. I bet that it's 260, 22, 50. And then, maybe you're right, maybe you're wrong. If it makes what's bad about Twitter seem less bad, then I think it's good. And I will have done some service in having written my dumb blog post.
One that you cited that I saw as it went up, and I knew where it was going before you pointed it out, and I guess everybody did, and I can't think of who it was, but the political writer who actually went for the finally Donald Trump has become presidential thing.
Yeah.
And I just thought, with real sincerity, I mean, I was kind of disgusted because somebody always goes for the okie doke. There's always a sucker, and we have to keep going through this. But at the same time, I just thought, oh no, this poor guy.
Yeah. His name's Philip Rucker. He's the White House correspondent for the Washington Post. And it's you could see in that moment, I think just because everybody that has an opinion on that sort of thing, and a lot of them are invested in Rucker being wrong in that assessment, that they're all watching the same thing. He just happily extrudes this little thoughtlet into Twitter where everybody can kick it around, and you could see that one, it had loud tools, I guess would be the scouting term. Right? That was fucking 80 grade wrongheadedness. And you could see that unless something went really wrong, it was going to get the recognition that it deserved.
Never mind being invested in it. It's just, let's be realistic. A thing is what it is sometimes. And we could never do that in baseball, right? Clayton Kershaw is one of the best left-handers in baseball. Or Chris Sale is one of the best left-handers in baseball. So we're watching a Red Sox game, and Chris Sale goes off the mound. He walks into the dugout. He's sweaty. He towels off, and he reaches out with his right hand, and he picks up a cup of Gatorade, and he drinks it. And then Jerry Remy goes on the broadcast and said, now is the day that Chris Sale became a right-hander. No. Just no. He happened to use his right hand at that moment. That's it.
Yeah. It would also be, I think the more appropriate thing would be if there was an obvious earpiece in his ear and you could see a team of guys in suits clearly mouthing the words right hand on the Gatorade cup while it's all happening. But yeah, I mean, I think that's extremely well put. And it is the sort of thing too, I think, especially where Trump is concerned, because he's so exhausting and because living in a world that where he's so important is so exhausting that like I think people are still kind of trying to talk themselves into it to a certain extent. Not that he's going to be a good or even adequate president, or that he'll ever be personally up to the job. But I think that there's like, if you're Philip Rucker and you have to think about Trump every day for however many years he's in office, like, yeah, sure, whatever, like fucking float it. Like maybe it's true. You probably want it to be true. Like what if he showed up tomorrow and he could talk? Like how much better would that make Philip Rucker's life,
It would make him able to do what he signed up to do. And if you want a baseball analogy, I always feel for the announcers and beat guys who have to show up, not necessarily for this year's Mets, but maybe for this year's Giants and the San Francisco Giants. I mean, not the football Giants, but the guys who are used to covering a pennant winning team and a team that's competitive, and they have one that's going to lose 100 games instead.
I guess that's like when you are sort of tested in that, but it's weird because you can't really just say that America's having a rebuilding season, or that, it's been a down year and there was a lot of injuries and whatever. I mean, it's like this, that all fits. And yet, like, at the same time, I don't know what happens when America loses 109 games.
I think that's actually very apt that America is having a rebuilding season. And I was thinking about that today to bring us full circle with the anniversary of 9/11. And I was watching The Big Short the other day, which I hadn't seen. And I recommend, if you haven't seen it. History is long, right? And it's only been 16 years since 9/11. It's not a long time. And as your still current essay from 5 years ago shows, we're still living in the consequences of that. We are still living in a world in which we're at perpetual war with the people that perpetrated that, or at least still present in that country, Afghanistan.
Or people that live near them.
Yeah, or adjacent to them in some way. And
that an idiot could mistake for them.
Right. And as was true during the Cold War, where our resources were allocated for different purposes, but in the same kind of way, every dollar that we spend in that line is a dollar we don't spend on the environment or schools or infrastructure or whatever. And there's a real cost. And yet we have, at least for this period of time, accepted that that is the state of things. And again, not to take a side on that. It's just the reality of it. Similarly, the crash of 2008, we are absolutely still dealing with that. I'm glad the economy is kind of cooking along at this sort of minimal level that it's cooking along, but we are in no way having go-go times. And so no time at all has passed, and we're still living in kind of the backwash of these great events. So I think rebuilding phase is a very apt thing, David.
Yeah, dude, I'd love to get to work, strip some assets, develop some prospects, and see if maybe we can't do better than this. The idea of like continuing to do the same stuff and pretending that somehow that won't crash next time doesn't seem like a sustainable thing. Maybe if we extend Nori Aoki.
He's the guy you build around.
That's you start with that. That's like a franchise cornerstone. I think it'll be good. I think that Michael Conforto could use a little bit of a push.
He might break again just from using him.
Gosh.
Not using him didn't work. Using him didn't work, or did work until it didn't work.
Yeah, we have to try something else, whatever it is.
Exactly.
I think we should. Let's see if he can play tennis.
Forest Hills is right nearby.
I was gonna say, you don't even. It's the same. It's not even a MetroCard transfer. You just walk over the thing.
As we go out, I'm going to highlight one other piece that you wrote since we've last talked, without getting into it. And it was for the Baffler, and it was about Donald Trump, and the keywords in it are blank sucking nullity. And that's probably as far as we should go with it. Although, and this may be a conversation for off the air or some other podcast that I'm not doing yet, but I'm going to challenge you on that at some point, because I think you strayed into Hannah Arendt banality of evil territory, and I think maybe you let the guy off too easily.
That is the first time I've heard that particular critique of the piece. The too easily stuff. But yeah, anyway, that's interesting. I would like to talk more about that.
David, as always, thank you for dropping by. This was a wide-ranging and educational conversation that had all kinds of baseball in it, and yet I'm sure I will hear from a lot of people who said that it didn't have any.
Yeah, I mean, there were football elements in it, but I think it would qualify as like a mostly baseball podcast.
Exactly. And we will both look forward to the postseason and some meaningful baseball after 162 games of teams not being able to get out of their own way. Thank you, David.
Oh, yeah. Thanks, man.
By Hercules' 11th labor, we have made it to the end of another episode. You can follow David Roth on Twitter at David_J_Roth. You know where that underscore key is, don't you? It's not hard to find. And you can follow me at Go Stephen Goldman. Why Go Stephen Goldman? Because at Go West Young Man might lead you to wander into an earthquake zone, and I wouldn't want to be responsible for that. You can also write us at infiniteinning@gmail.com, and please, I beg of you, please, rate us at the podcatcher of your choice, iTunes or what have you. Every positive review helps keep this program alive. We have a sponsor now, but this episode is nonetheless brought to you by the number 16. Ever since I mentioned that Bill Bevins bit earlier in the show, my producer's just wandering about the office saying, "Here comes the tying run, and here comes the winning run," over and over again in a really bad Red Barber impression, but he won't get back to work. Our theme song, which you are listening to now and have listened to throughout the episode, was co-written by myself and Dr. Rick Mooring, and he and I are going to have bad Dunkin' Donuts coffee later because friendship is a garden, you have to tend it, and bad coffee is just the price you have to pay. Well, if I can just get the ghost of Leo DeRocher to get back in the closet and stop challenging me to a game of billiards, I'll be back next week, and we'll have more tales and discussion from inside the infinite inning.